Have you ever had your microphone cut off in front of 500 people just as you tried to warn them about a ticking bomb? The executives thought one click of the mute button would hide their greed, but they forgot the golden rule of Silicon Valley. You never cross the person holding the master encryption keys. If you want to hear how I turned a silencing click into a flawless, untraceable career execution, pull up a chair. Hello to all the amazing listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to survive and continue creating great stories for you. You can do this by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the description or comments below. Now, let me formally introduce myself. My name is Gracie Coleman, and this is my story. Chicago in the middle of February is a brutal, unforgiving place. The wind off Lake Michigan cuts through the downtown streets like shattered glass, stripping away any pretense or warmth. I always felt a certain kinship with that winter wind. At 34 years old, as the lead cybersecurity architect for Apex Merit Solutions, I preferred my reality exactly like that: cold, precise, and entirely devoid of vulnerabilities. Apex Merit was a colossal financial data broker, a bloated beast of a company currently dressing itself up for a massive initial public offering, while the executives spent their days bathing in the fake fluorescent glamour of the top floors, obsessing over optics, valuations, and corporate catering. I lived in the absolute truth of the data center. I did not care for office politics, networking, or the spotlight. I cared about the architecture. I was the sole architect behind what we called the Zero Trust Mesh. It was a labyrinthine, biometric-driven access system that served as the digital vault for the credit card information, social security numbers, and financial histories of 40 million users, 40 million lives, digitized and entrusted to our servers. Every single swipe, every loan application, every late payment was locked behind my digital walls. The mesh was my masterpiece. It trusted absolutely no one, not even the chief executive officer. Without multiple layers of cryptographic and biometric verification, in my world, human error was the ultimate enemy, and trust was just a polite, corporate word for a security flaw. Then came Julian Vance. Julian was our brand new chief strategy officer, parachuted in by the venture capital firm that was aggressively steering us toward the public market. He was exactly the kind of man who thrived on buzzwords and illusion. He practically breathed phrases like growth hacking, synergistic paradigm shifts, and disruptive agility. He wore suits tailored so tightly you could see the outline of his arrogance, and he possessed the incredibly dangerous belief that cybersecurity was nothing more than an annoying roadblock to cash flow. To Julian, my zero trust mesh was not a vital shield protecting our customers. It was merely a speed bump slowing down his precious profit margins. The silent war between us began when Julian started aggressively pushing to streamline our operational costs. He wanted to make the company look as lean and profitable as possible for the upcoming public offering. His grand idea was to outsource our core data analytics to a third-party startup based in Eastern Europe. They were incredibly cheap, and from my brief look at their infrastructure, there was a very good reason for that. Julian repeatedly demanded that I grant this untested startup a bypass, a direct backdoor through my security mesh, so they could vacuum up the raw data without jumping through our strict verification hoops. "We need to move fast, Gracie. We cannot let red tape choke our innovation," Julian would say, leaning over my desk, smelling of expensive cologne and cheap desperation. I refused. I did not just refuse verbally. I refused in writing, explicitly citing federal financial compliance laws and Securities and Exchange Commission mandates. I sent a formal, documented email outlining exactly how his proposed bypass would violate federal regulations and expose our clients to a catastrophic risk of a data breach. Julian smiled when he read it, but his eyes were entirely dead. From that exact moment, he marked me as an enemy. He held a bitter grudge, viewing me as an insubordinate technician who simply did not understand the big picture of modern business. I am not a fool, and I do not ignore a threat, no matter how well dressed it is. Knowing Julian's type, I anticipated a retaliatory strike. The executives always believe they hold all the cards because they control the payroll, but they fundamentally misunderstand how the digital world actually operates. I quietly went back and meticulously reviewed the original employment contract I signed when I was first brought on board. I confirmed the exact legal parameters of my liability, my operational jurisdiction, and my digital property rights. Once my legal footing was rock solid, I went to work, late at night, while the city froze outside my apartment window. I began writing a highly classified, hidden piece of code. I called it the Ghost Protocol. I wove this script incredibly deep into the core access system of the Zero Trust mesh. It was a digital trapdoor, buried under thousands of lines of routine encryption and masked by standard operational commands. It was designed so flawlessly that absolutely none of the company's automated code scanners, and certainly no third-party auditors, could ever read it or even know it existed. I was setting the board, preparing for the day Julian would inevitably try to forcefully remove my shield. It was Friday morning, exactly 9 o'clock, when the digital guillotine dropped. 500 employees of Apex Merit Solutions were corralled into the mandatory company-wide virtual all-hands meeting. My main monitor was a sea of tiny pixelated boxes, displaying the faces of engineers, analysts, and middle managers, all held hostage by the rigid etiquette of corporate video conferencing. In the center of it all, dominating the primary speaker view, was Julian Vance. He looked entirely too awake for a winter morning, beaming with the kind of synthetic enthusiasm that only highly paid executives can muster when they are about to sell out their own infrastructure. Julian cleared his throat, commanding the digital room. He was there to proudly announce his crowning achievement, a brand new initiative he had aggressively branded as the Data Unlocked Project, with a slick, heavily animated slide deck rolling in the background. He formally declared that Apex Merit had officially signed the contract with the Eastern European third-party analytics firm. He spoke at length about synergizing our data pipelines, optimizing our algorithmic throughput, and unlocking unprecedented value for our shareholders ahead of the initial public offering. To the marketing and sales teams, it sounded like visionary leadership. To anyone who understood the actual architecture of our network, it sounded like a man enthusiastically handing out the blueprints to our bank vault to a group of strangers standing in a dark alley. While Julian continued to fill the virtual room with meaningless buzzwords, my secondary monitor, positioned vertically to the left of the video call, suddenly flashed. It was not a standard notification. It was a severe, high-priority red alert originating directly from the core perimeter defenses. My eyes darted away from Julian's smiling face. Lines of diagnostic text began scrolling rapidly across my terminal. I leaned in, my heart rate remaining perfectly steady as my eyes tracked the automated intrusion logs. The external application programming interface firewall, the exact barrier I had spent months fortifying, was actively being drilled into. Someone with executive override privileges was forcefully provisioning a master access credential. They were carving a massive, unmonitored tunnel straight through the perimeter to make way for Julian's new, untested partners. It was a catastrophic breach of protocol, happening live, right under the noses of 500 oblivious employees. I did not hesitate. I moved my cursor over to the video conferencing window and clicked the microphone icon. The small red slash disappeared. Julian, you are opening a backdoor into Tier 1 data. This violates security standards and will expose client information. My voice cut through his energetic presentation like a scalpel. It was calm, entirely devoid of emotion, but heavy with the undeniable authority of the person who actually built the system they were standing on. For exactly 2 seconds, the virtual room plunged into a deafening, horrifying silence. 500 people stopped breathing. Julian paused mid-sentence, his eyes flicked down to his screen, his jaw tightening as the veneer of the visionary leader cracked. revealing the irritated middle manager underneath. He did not look apologetic. He looked deeply inconvenienced. Then it happened. A sharp artificial click echoed in my headset. I looked down at my screen. My microphone icon had instantly reverted to a bright, glaring red, crossed out by a harsh diagonal line. I tried to click it again. A small gray system prompt appeared in the center of my screen, informing me that the meeting host had muted me and disabled my ability to unmute myself. The sheer, suffocating violence of that tiny user interface element was staggering. In a single keystroke, the technology I dedicated my life to securing was weaponized to gag me. Julian had instructed his assistant, the meeting host, to simply erase my voice from the room. Julian's face relaxed back into that same half-smile. He looked directly into his webcam, addressing the silent masses. "Thank you for the concern, Gracie, but we need to think outside of dusty old procedure manuals." He dismissed a catastrophic security breach with the wave of a hand, treating me like an anxious secretary who had misplaced a stapler. He immediately seamlessly pivoted back to his presentation, his voice washing over the muted crowd, burying my warning under an avalanche of corporate jargon. Almost instantly, my Slack application exploded. The notification chime began ringing with a frantic, rhythmic panic. My security team was watching the same firewall logs I was, and they were watching their lead architect get publicly humiliated and silenced. "Gracie, what is happening? Did he just mute you? The API gateway is wide open. They are routing past the mesh. Do we pull the emergency kill switch?" The messages cascaded down my screen in a waterfall of digital terror. My team was looking to me for orders, their text bubbles vibrating with the anxiety of professionals watching a slow-motion car crash. I did not type a single word in response. I sat perfectly still in my quiet, freezing apartment, the Chicago wind howling faintly against the glass. I stared at that bright red crossed-out microphone icon. The anger in my chest was not hot or explosive. It was absolute zero. I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that no one in that virtual meeting could see. I reached out and pulled my keyboard toward me. I opened a hidden, encrypted command line interface that bypassed the standard operating system entirely. I did not try to stop Julian's breach. I did not fight the mute button. Instead, my fingers flew across the keys, typing out a single, devastatingly precise string of characters. I hit the enter key. The terminal blinked once, confirming that the Ghost protocol was now fully awake and silently executing in the deep background of the server infrastructure. The trap was set. I reached up and smoothly closed my laptop. The screen went black. The frantic voices, the panicked messages, and Julian's smug face vanished entirely. I stood up from my desk, grabbed my heavy winter coat, and decided to take a half day off. I was going to get a very large, very warm cup of coffee and let them blindly walk into the abyss. The weekend arrived with a heavy, oppressive silence settling over the corporate network. While the physical office spaces in the financial district remained entirely empty, the digital corridors were buzzing with a frantic, unauthorized energy. Julian and his hand-picked team of compliant, desperate engineers were working overtime, rapidly packaging and transferring our application programming interface keys over to their new bargain basement partners overseas. They operated under the arrogant, fatal assumption that my abrupt departure on Friday afternoon was an act of quiet surrender. In their shallow minds, they believed I had run the risk calculation and decided that keeping my lucrative salary and my unvested stock options right before our initial public offering was far more important than my professional integrity. They mistook my silence for submission. They fundamentally failed to understand that a seasoned hunter does not scream or thrash when the prey finally steps blindly onto the hidden trigger plate. What Julian and his lackeys completely failed to realize was that the single command I had executed before shutting down my machine did not patch the hole he was violently drilling into our defenses. I had absolutely no intention of stopping the leak. Instead, my hidden script functioned as an invisible digital switch track. silently diverting the unauthorized tunnel away from our primary data centers and routing it straight into a meticulously constructed phantom zone. In our industry, we call it a sandbox. It was an absolutely perfect, one-to-one architectural replica of the real Tier 1 database environment. It possessed the exact same folder structures, the identical file weights, and the precisely replicated encryption headers. However, the information inside was a masterclass in algorithmic deception. It was entirely synthetic. The system was now cheerfully feeding our new partners terabytes of mathematically convincing garbage, consisting of randomized credit card formats that would always fail standard checksums and fabricated demographic profiles mapped to empty geographical zones. Meanwhile, the genuine, bleeding heart reality of our business was locked away in a vault that only I could see or touch. The highly sensitive financial histories of 40 million actual human beings were instantly partitioned and encrypted locally on an isolated, hardened server node. I wrapped those critical files in a proprietary cryptographic shell, sealing them shut with a localized biometric hash. More importantly, I finalized the lockdown using my personal, legally binding digital signature. This was a specific cryptographic certificate issued and rigorously verified by the state, tied directly to my professional engineering licensing. By federal law, no one could legally decrypt that vault without my physical presence, my biometric input, and my explicit documented authorization. Not the board of directors, not the chief executive officer, and certainly not a reckless strategy executive chasing a quarterly bonus. I had effectively taken the company's most valuable, irreplaceable asset hostage in order to save it from being recklessly slaughtered. Back in the corporate monitoring suite, the very first ripples of the anomaly began to push outward. Elena, our head of legal, and Marcus, the chief compliance officer, were the only executives who actively monitored the automated weekend security reports. By Saturday evening, they started noticing bizarre, terrifying spikes in our outbound data telemetry. The raw network bandwidth consumption was surging by hundreds of %, registering as a massive, unnatural hemorrhage of data rushing toward an unverified, external Internet Protocol address located thousands of miles away. Marcus frantically tried to cross-reference the outbound traffic logs with the executive monitoring dashboards to understand the breach. But Julian, constantly anticipating bureaucratic pushback, had already forced his engineering team to apply a cosmetic filtering overlay onto the primary reporting software. The dashboard Julian controlled displayed a serene, comforting sea of green checkmarks, falsely reporting to the rest of the company that system stability was at 100% and data transfer rates were completely nominal. The raw network warning lights were flashing a blinding red, but the executive alarms had been purposefully disconnected. I spent my entire Sunday completely disconnected from the digital world. I turned my smartphone completely off, manually removed the battery, and tossed it into the back of a wooden desk drawer. I did not log into my secure backup terminal. I did not check my emergency encrypted email server. Instead, I walked down to the local winter market, bought an array of fresh, organic ingredients, and spent the late afternoon methodically preparing a complex, slow-cooked beef bourguignon. I poured myself a generous glass of dry red wine and stood by the window, watching the heavy snow begin to fall over the freezing city skyline. I listened to smooth jazz on a vintage vinyl record player, thoroughly enjoying the warm, analog imperfections of the sound. The contrast was deeply, satisfyingly poetic. While I stood in my warm, fragrant kitchen, carefully measuring out herbs and spices with exact, unyielding precision, the internal architecture of Apex Merit Solutions was silently bleeding out in the dark, counting down the hours to a catastrophic, inevitable detonation. They had loudly demanded a bypassed, frictionless system, and I had given them exactly what they asked for. The trap was fully sprung. Now, all I had to do was wait for the wire to snap. It happened at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, while I was sound asleep, enjoying the absolute quiet of my apartment. The highly optimized, aggressively cheap Eastern European servers that Julian had so proudly championed violently imploded. They did not just experience a minor outage, they were completely and utterly hijacked. A highly sophisticated ransomware syndicate had effortlessly punched through their paper-thin perimeter defenses and successfully encrypted their entire local infrastructure in a matter of minutes. The very first warning sign did not come from an internal diagnostic tool, because Julian had forced his team to silence them all. Instead, it arrived as a mass, automated email delivered directly to the private inboxes of the entire Apex Merit Executive Board. The message was incredibly brief, visually stark, and absolutely terrifying. It contained a single, untraceable link leading to a dark web forum and a highly specific financial demand. The criminal syndicate proudly claimed to possess the entirety of our recently acquired database. They demanded a ransom of exactly $10 million, to be paid exclusively in untraceable Bitcoin within 48 hours. If the payment was not received, they promised to publicly dump the raw financial records of every single client onto the open internet for anyone to download. According to the building entry logs and the frantic security footage I reviewed a few days later, Julian Vance's smartphone began screaming on his nightstand exactly 3 minutes after that ransom email was dispatched. I can only imagine the sheer, visceral terror that washed over him as he read the words, $10 million glowing in the darkness of his luxury condominium. He did not bother putting on one of his tightly tailored, expensive suits. He arrived at the downtown corporate plaza wearing a wrinkled designer tracksuit, his face pale and slick with a cold, greasy sweat. He sprinted through the main lobby, frantically swiping his executive badge, and practically kicked the heavy glass doors of the IT department off their hinges. "Shut it down! Shut the entire data pipeline down right now!" Julian screamed at the absolute top of his lungs, startling the small skeleton crew of night shift engineers who were already drowning in a sea of flashing red error screens. He hovered aggressively over their shoulders, his voice cracking with unchecked panic, desperately demanding that they instantly revoke the application programming interface keys and manually sever the external connection. But his loud, aggressive commands were utterly useless. The digital hemorrhage had already completed its cycle hours ago. The connection was completely dead because the third-party servers were already locked down by the attackers. The digital vault was empty, and the thieves were long gone. The realization hit Julian like a physical blow to the stomach. The brilliant growth-hacking strategy he had proudly paraded in front of 500 people during the all-hands meeting had just caused the single largest catastrophic data breach in the history of the financial sector. While Julian was busy terrorizing the junior IT staff and frantically pacing the floor, Marcus, our chief compliance officer, was desperately trying to get a hold of me. My phone, of course, was still powered completely off and sitting safely inside my wooden desk drawer. After the fifth failed attempt to reach my voicemail, Marcus was legally and procedurally forced to initiate the emergency glass break protocol. This extreme security measure completely bypassed the filtered, executive-friendly dashboards Julian had constructed to hide his mess. It gave Marcus direct, unvarnished, read-only access to the raw, foundational server logs. Marcus sat alone in his dark office, the harsh blue light of his dual monitors reflecting off his glasses as he began to trace the forensic footprint of the massive data transfer. He was desperately searching for the structural vulnerability, hoping to find a sophisticated zero-day exploit or an architectural flaw that allowed the hackers to siphon the database. Instead, he found a meticulously documented, undeniable trail of sheer executive arrogance. Every single time a firewall layer had been disabled, every single instance where a biometric prompt was bypassed, the underlying system had dutifully recorded the exact user who authorized the override. Marcus slowly scrolled through page after page of critical security warnings. Each warning was accompanied by a brutal, unerasable digital receipt. Critical system warning ignored. Override authorized by user account J. Vance. Tier 1, data flow restriction lifted. Override authorized by user account J. Vance. Master access granted to unverified external node. Override authorized by user account J. Vance. Julian had not just accidentally left a window open for the hackers. He had systematically dismantled the entire alarm system, unchained the gates, and left a signed confession on the front porch. Marcus slowly took off his glasses, his hands shaking slightly as he realized that the brilliant, fast-tracking executive had personally, entirely by his own hand, signed his own professional death warrant. Julian was solely responsible for the destruction of the company. But here is the most beautiful, deeply poetic part of the entire disaster. A spectacular irony that the terrified executives sweating in the corporate boardroom were completely oblivious to, thousands of miles away, sitting in a damp concrete basement surrounded by energy drink cans. The ransomware hackers were eagerly preparing to verify their massive score. In the criminal underworld, you always have to decrypt a small, random sample of the stolen data and post it publicly to prove to your victims that you actually possess the authentic goods. The lead hacker cracked his knuckles, ran his advanced decryption algorithm against a heavily encrypted file block explicitly labeled as Tier 1 financial records, and aggressively hit the Enter key. He was fully expecting his screen to fill with a goldmine of highly lucrative Social Security numbers, home addresses, and high-limit credit card details. Instead, the command terminal window flooded with absolutely useless, mathematically generated garbage. There were endless strings of random letters and numbers that formed absolutely no coherent pattern, designed specifically to waste their processing power. And buried incredibly deep within those file structures, deliberately planted within the synthetic codebase by yours truly, were hundreds of low-resolution image files. When the confused hackers opened the image files, expecting to find scanned passports or driver licenses, they were greeted by heavily pixelated internet memes. Specifically, they found dozens of pictures of chubby orange cats wearing tiny, ridiculous sunglasses, accompanied by bold white text that cheerfully read, "Access denied, better luck next time." They had successfully executed a highly coordinated attack against the most heavily guarded financial network they had ever targeted, only to successfully steal 10 terabytes of weaponized, utterly worthless digital trash. However, the beautiful, excruciating tragedy of that Tuesday morning was that Apex Merit Solutions did not know this yet. As the sun began to slowly rise over the freezing Chicago skyline, Julian, Marcus, and the rest of the leadership team were trapped in a state of absolute, suffocating terror. They genuinely believed that 40 million lives were about to be ruined, that the federal regulators were going to raid the building by noon, and that the highly anticipated initial public offering was completely dead in the water. They were currently drowning in the exact disaster they had aggressively demanded, totally unaware that the only life raft in existence was sitting quietly on my desk, wrapped securely in my personal encryption key. By 8 o'clock on Wednesday morning, the executive boardroom on the 50th floor felt less like a strategic command center and far more like a holding cell. The building's air conditioning was running at absolute maximum capacity. Yet nearly every single board member was sweating heavily through their bespoke designer suits. The atmosphere was thick, suffocating under the very real, very imminent threat of federal prison time. A $10 million ransom demand was a severe crisis, but an active investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding the negligent loss of 40 million financial records was an absolute extinction-level event. At the head of the long mahogany table stood Julian, the polished, arrogant visionary who had commanded the virtual stage on Friday was completely gone. In his place was a cornered, desperate animal, his tie loosened, nervously clutching a stack of freshly printed, entirely fabricated incident reports. Knowing that Marcus had been digging through the logs, Julian was aggressively trying to construct a scapegoat out of thin air before the truth fully materialized. This was a systemic structural failure, a fundamental architectural flaw deeply embedded within the core network by our internal engineering team. Julian stammered, his voice entirely lacking its usual smooth, confident cadence. He violently slapped the fake report onto the polished wood table. The security protocols were built entirely too rigidly, creating invisible blind spots. When our new partners attempted a standard external handshake protocol, the legacy system buckled. And frankly, The catastrophic failure to adequately warn leadership of this fragility falls entirely on the lead architect. She failed to properly escalate the threat matrix. I strongly recommend her immediate termination with extreme prejudice to show the federal regulators we are taking swift, decisive action. Just as the final word left his mouth, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. I walked into the room. I was not wearing a panicked, apologetic expression, nor was I wearing a compliant corporate blazer. I wore my favorite black leather jacket. My heavy combat boots, echoing loudly and deliberately against the hardwood floor. In my right hand, I casually held a large iced matcha latte. The sheer, terrifying calmness of my demeanor hit the panicked, sweating room like a physical wave of ice water. Julian immediately turned a deep, unhealthy shade of purple. The sight of me, perfectly relaxed and sipping a beverage while his entire professional world burned to the ground, shattered whatever fragile composure he had left. "What in the world are you doing in here?" Julian screamed, his voice cracking violently as he pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "You are entirely responsible for this catastrophe. You built a fragile system, you failed to monitor the outbound data flow, and you deliberately kept executive leadership in the dark. I want corporate security up here right now. You are fired. You are entirely done in this industry." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced matcha. The ice cubes clinked softly, the only sound in the completely silent room. I did not look at Julian. I did not speak to Julian. I treated him exactly like a deprecated, completely useless line of legacy code that I was about to permanently delete from the server. Instead, I walked straight past his screaming fit and approached the opposite end of the massive table where Elena, the head of legal, and Marcus, the chief compliance officer, were sitting in stunned silence. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a thick, physically printed dossier tightly bound in a black folder. I placed it gently on the table right in front of Marcus, right next to the folder. I set down a small, heavy metal universal serial bus drive. "Marcus, Elena," I said, my voice quiet, flat, and perfectly steady. "I believe the board is currently reviewing a highly altered, cosmetically filtered version of the disaster timeline. I have brought the raw, unaltered, legally binding system logs directly from the Foundation nodes. I strongly suggest you open the folder and read page 4 aloud for the entire room to hear." Julian lunged forward across the table, desperately trying to grab the black folder. But Marcus snatched it first, pulling it securely against his chest. Marcus opened the heavy cover. The room was so intensely quiet you could clearly hear the thick paper rustling. Marcus adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning rapidly down the page. His face drained of all remaining color, and then his jaw hardened into a look of absolute, furious disgust. At exactly 9:14 on Friday morning, Marcus began reading aloud, his deep, authoritative voice carrying into every single corner of the room. A critical alert regarding a Tier 1 perimeter breach was actively triggered by the primary security system. The automated defense requested a hard reset to sever the unauthorized connection. This request was manually overridden and permanently disabled. The authorizing digital signature, logged natively by the system, belongs exclusively to the user account J. Vance. A collective, sharp gasp rippled through the seated board members. Julian stood completely frozen at the head of the table, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. "There is more evidence," I said softly, gesturing toward the small metal drive sitting on the table. "Please plug that in, Elena. It contains an unedited copy of the administrative video recording from Friday's all-hands meeting. It is the exact recording that Julian legally mandated for company archives to preserve his historic announcement." Elena quickly grabbed the drive and plugged it directly into the boardroom presentation system. The massive flat screen on the back wall flickered instantly to life. Suddenly, the pixelated faces of 500 employees appeared on the screen, with Julian standing front and center, smiling brightly in his expensive suit. The audio played incredibly crisp and clear through the ceiling speakers. "Julian, you are opening a back door into Tier 1 data. This violates security standards and will expose client information. It was my voice, ringing out in the cold boardroom exactly as it had on Friday. And then, the entire board of directors watched in horrifying, undeniable high definition as Julian smirked, casually glanced down at his screen, and deliberately signaled his meeting host to cut my microphone. The massive screen clearly showed my audio icon turn bright red, struck through with a harsh diagonal line. "Thank you for the concern, Gracie," the digital Julian echoed from the overhead speakers, his voice dripping with unbearable condescension. "But we need to think outside of dusty old procedure manuals." Elena hit the spacebar, pausing the video right on Julian's smug, arrogant, smiling face. The silence that followed in the physical boardroom was absolute, crushing, and deeply final. Every single pair of eyes in the room slowly turned away from the frozen image on the screen and locked dead onto the real Julian Vance. He was now gripping the edge of the table, trembling violently, as the horrifying realization set in that his brilliant, fast-tracked career was not just over, it had been meticulously and legally buried alive. The heavy silence in the boardroom was suddenly broken by the chairman of the board, an older man who looked as though he had aged 10 years in the last 5 minutes. He rubbed his temples, refusing to even look in Julian's direction. "The compliance violations are undeniable," the chairman said, his voice trembling with exhausted defeat. "But it does not change our immediate reality. The perimeter was breached. The hackers have 40 million financial profiles, and they are demanding $10 million by tomorrow. We are still facing federal ruin." I took one final, slow sip of my iced matcha, placing the plastic cup down on the expensive mahogany table. The quiet thud commanded the absolute attention of every single executive in the room. "You are all operating under the tragically flawed assumption that Julian Vance actually had access to the real data vault," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear across the long table. "When Julian forced his unauthorized backdoor into the network, my security protocols did exactly what I designed them to do. The system recognized a catastrophic compliance failure originating from an executive account. It immediately quarantined the genuine database." Elena leaned forward, her eyes wide with desperate, fragile hope. "Gracie, what exactly are you saying?" "I am saying that the massive trove of data those hackers violently extracted from our Eastern European partners is entirely worthless," I explained, letting a sharp, confident smile touch my lips. "It is a synthetic sandbox, a highly sophisticated decoy environment completely filled with mathematically generated garbage, fake credit card numbers, and a very large collection of internet memes. Our actual clients are perfectly safe. No client data ever left my servers." The collective sigh of relief that washed over the boardroom was a physical, palpable force. Men in expensive suits slumped back into their leather chairs, wiping cold sweat from their foreheads. The chairman let out a breathless laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated salvation. They had just been pulled back from the absolute brink of corporate annihilation, but their relief was dangerously premature. I was not finished. "However," I continued, cutting through their quiet celebrations with a voice like sharpened steel, "to ensure absolute security against Julian's reckless internal sabotage, the authentic database of 40 million users is currently locked in an offline, air-gapped node. It is encrypted locally, and it is sealed shut with my personal, state-issued biometric cryptographic certificate. As of right now, I am the only living human being legally and technically capable of bringing Apex Merit Solutions back online." The atmosphere in the room shifted violently from relief to a terrified, breathless realization. The board of directors suddenly understood the terrifying new power dynamic. They were no longer the masters of the universe. They were completely at my mercy. Julian, sensing his final opportunity to survive, slammed his hands on the table. "You cannot do that. That is corporate extortion. Order her to hand over the key right now." I slowly turned my head and looked directly into Julian's panicked, bloodshot eyes. "You want your right to conduct business back?" I asked, addressing the entire board while maintaining my lethal stare on Julian. Fine. But first, I am pressing federal security violation charges against Julian Vance. The undeniable proof of his negligence, his gross incompetence, and his deliberate sabotage of federal compliance standards is sitting right there on that universal serial bus drive. You are going to hand him over to the authorities immediately, or I walk out that door, and your company stays dark forever. The board did not even need to cast a formal vote. The decision to sacrifice Julian to save their own wealth was instantaneous. The chairman picked up the phone on the conference table and immediately summoned building security. The resulting scene was the most profoundly satisfying moment of my entire professional career. Two large, broad-shouldered security guards entered the boardroom and physically grabbed Julian by his arms. He thrashed, he screamed, and he begged. He threatened to sue every single person in the room, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkling as they forcibly dragged him backward toward the heavy oak doors. His golden parachute was gone. His unvested equity was instantly voided due to criminal negligence. His reputation in Silicon Valley was permanently erased. The self-proclaimed visionary was being thrown out with the trash. Once the doors closed and Julian's frantic screaming faded down the hallway, the chairman turned back to me, his hands folded neatly on the table. He looked at me with a newfound, deeply ingrained respect, tinged with a very healthy dose of fear. "What are your terms, Gracie?" the chairman asked quietly. "I am taking over as the Chief Information Security Officer," I stated, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "My base salary is to be multiplied by 3, effective immediately, paid retroactively for this pay period. Furthermore, I require a legally binding clause in my new contract granting me absolute, unquestionable veto power over any and all network infrastructure decisions. No more cheap third-party vendors, no more fast-tracked growth hacks. We do security my way, or we do not do it at all." Elena, the head of legal, was already sliding a fresh notepad across the table, frantically writing down my demands to draft the new paperwork. The chairman simply nodded, completely defeated and entirely relieved. 30 minutes later, I walked back onto the quiet, heavily air-conditioned engineering floor. I sat down in my comfortable, ergonomic chair and woke my laptop from its sleep mode. I opened the encrypted command line interface with a single, satisfying strike of the Enter key. I authorized the biometric release. Across the room, the massive server monitors instantly flashed from a warning red to a serene, steady green. The digital fortress was restored. I took a final sip of my iced matcha, looking at the perfectly secure network, and muttered quietly to myself, "Next time, do not mute my mic." Thank you so much to all the incredible listeners for tuning in to today's story. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story satisfying and entertaining, please consider helping us out. As I mentioned earlier, YouTube has disabled our monetization, so we rely entirely on the kindness of our audience. By supporting us with just $1, you give us the budget to pay our hardworking team, helping them feed their families and allowing us to continue creating and bringing you even more amazing revenge stories. You can support us by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, or by clicking the donation link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Thank you for your incredible generosity, and I will see you in the next story.